Coming up to 16 minutes past 10. Yesterday, Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull talked about his vision for the nation. A high-wage, generous social welfare net, first world economy where, and I quote, fairness is absolutely critical. Now, there was no specific mention in that speech of raising the GST, although that is where the taxation reform debate has centred this week. And there's always a whiff of danger in this country when we raise the goods and services tax. So what is it about the GST that's such political poison for some, so tempting for others? How do other people view the idea of a consumption tax elsewhere? With me now for this week's Long View on Politics is John Passant, Graduate Teaching Fellow at the ANU School of Politics and International Relations. Tax has been something of a specialty. John, good morning to you.
Hi Genevieve, how are you?
I'm well. What's the history of the GST as an idea? Where does this notion of a consumption tax come from?
Well, it was initially proposed by academics back in the early 1900s and really only first got adopted in France in 1954, and then it became part of the criteria for joining the European Union. And so it spread from there. It really is a European idea that has spread around the world.
And of course, not that long in operation here in Australia. We've had it for some time, but it's a reasonably recent introduction.
Yeah, that's right. From after the 1988 election, 2000, the GST came into operation.
And from that very moment, intense discussion, intense debate, intense antipathy and intense support. What do you think is especially important about the GST as a taxation reform this time round, rather than, say, looking, as ACOS argued to me yesterday, at super concessions and negative gearing and payroll taxes and all sorts of other things that people feel are unfair or limiting?
Well, I think that if you look at a GST overall, the point that ACOS and many others make is that it's a regressive tax, that poor people and people on lower wages will pay more tax as out of their income than rich people. And the figures all show that. The NatSem, National Centre for Economic and Social Modelling, shows that it would be any change to the GST that is being proposed would impact on poor people and those on salary and wages, on lower salary and wages more. And I think one of the other things about this debate is, why are we just talking about a GST? A whole range of other taxes. Now, you mentioned the superannuation concessions and you mentioned negative gearing will come up in the discussion, but I think there are wider issues here as well. If, as Prime Minister Turnbull said, if we're talking about fairness, then why aren't we also talking about a more progressive tax system, one that increases tax rates on the very well-off, and a wealth tax, for example? There's no discussion of a wealth tax at the moment.
I mean, it's an interesting question because, as you said, a consumption tax is a pretty common tool. It has been post-war across any number of developed countries. The Scandinavian countries, for example, that have consumption taxes at around 25%, although I understand that in Sweden food is taxed at a separate rate. That's a very different social compact, but we do see this operating effectively in other countries, don't we?
Yes, it operates, as I said, in the European Union. It operates in New Zealand, for example, and they've just had a change to their tax rate from 12.5%, well, 5 years ago, from 12.5% to 15%. And I think the beauty for governments of a thing like a goods and services tax or a consumption tax is that it just sits there and it just comes in, the money flows in. And people don't notice it after a while, that your prices go up. You've been supposedly compensated by tax cuts or increased social welfare spending, and then you just get used to it. It's just part of the price.
Well, New Zealand is raised again and again because they have the consumption tax. They've raised their consumption tax. What's your measure of how John Key and his government have managed this? Because, of course, New Zealand is at least superficially similar to us. So what do you think has worked there?
Well, I think if you look at New Zealand specifically, the difference between New Zealand and Australia in terms of the tax debate has been that it was a Labor government that introduced the first GST in New Zealand. So Paul Keating tried a consumption tax in 1986 with option C. That got rejected by the unions and business, surprisingly. And then Labor was locked into a position in 1993 of opposition to a GST. Whereas in New Zealand, because Labor was part of the political elite that introduced the GST, it's a lot harder to see opposition to it. And so that John Key, I think, can come in and say we're going to increase the GST, even though the polls at the time when he said that showed massive opposition, about 69-70% of opposition. It wasn't enough to force people to vote against him at the next election. So I think there's a lesson there for Malcolm Turnbull, who I suspect is using John Key as an example, as a way to go forward of talking to people, trying to convince them of the benefits. But as I said before, the problem with the GST is it's regressive. It will impact on poor people. It will impact on low paid wages, people on low wages. And there are other alternatives that exist that could be explored as well. And maybe part of Turnbull's process will be to talk about changing the superannuation concessions as a sop to say, well, look, we are doing some things about the big end of town as well.
Well, I think you would have to, wouldn't you, if you were going to even think about raising the GST, and the suggestion's been 15%, but even if you were to take, 12% or something like that, you would absolutely have to say, look, we're dealing with things that are patently unfair for ordinary working Australians. We're going to take away some of those kicks in the system that impact the lower end of the socio-economic demographic more severely. You'd absolutely have to do it. But there's such a lot of political fear about this, isn't there? I mean, it's almost been sort of visceral, the fear of what the electorate will do to you if you do anything to the GST.
Well, that's an interesting point. If you look at Australia's history, 1998, John Howard goes to an election proposing a GST, and he actually loses the popular vote on the two-party preferred, so it was 51 to 49 or thereabouts. But it didn't translate into seats. He still won a majority of seats. I think the practice and what has happened over time has been that John Howard shows you can put forward a GST, and if it's couched in explainable terms and comes with compensation, then people will maybe not embrace it and love it, but say, well, it's got to be done. But I think the other issue here is that if you look at compensation, for example, the tax cuts for the GST in 1998 were eroded by bracket creep over time. So compensation itself changes over time. And I think that's the long game, that we say, we'll give you tax cuts, but in 5 years' time, those tax cuts will have been eroded by base erosion.
And I really wonder about this notion of compensation, because the ideas that have been floated seem either imprecise or inefficient. Mike Baird has suggested that we look at compensating everyone with a family income under $100,000, but it's really unclear how you would measure that, because, of course, people aren't taxed on a family income. You're taxed on your individual income. There have been other suggestions that people could claim back their GST, but that becomes a massively complicated sort of layer of processes where it's unlikely that the people who are most severely impacted would ever follow through, simply because it's so complex.
That's right. I think if you look at the Mike Baird proposal, 100,000 households with $100,000 income, well, that might be one taxpayer, might be two taxpayers, and then you've got very different outcomes because we tax on individuals, not households. And I think that's part of the issue. And I think the compensation will basically be tax cuts. So if you've got a job, you'll get some tax cuts, or increased social welfare spending. But even increased social welfare spending doesn't improve the overall position, which is 2.5 million people live in poverty in Australia. 660,000 of them are children. So if all you're doing is compensating them for the increased costs of a GST, you're not actually improving their position. You're still leaving them in poverty. So I think we need that wider vision, and I hope that wider vision is discussed in the politics of the discussion about a GST.
I've got quite a few texts coming in on this. Ian says, Jen, could you please ask your guest about a transaction tax and whether that's plausible? What are your thoughts?
If he means by that a Tobin tax and a tax on international transfers, I think that's one of the options that we should be considering. But although I am worried about that in the sense that the banks will just pass it on to ordinary consumers, and so we end up bearing the cost of that as well.
Chris says, why not bring back death taxes? Death duties?
In fact, I wrote an article the other day for an online group called Independent Australia, in which I actually argued for that as well, both death duties and gift duties, which were common in Australia until the 1970s when Joh Bjelke-Petersen abolished them in Queensland, and then there was a flow through to other states who wanted to keep their older retirees in their states as a consequence. And I think, well, what's wrong with estate duties and death duties, gift duties? Why aren't they on the agenda?
Coming from a farming background, death duties were horrendous for the farmers at the time. But anyway, moving on. Ed has texted me too to say, Jen, I can remember when the GST was introduced into Australia, the promise was made never to increase it despite other countries experiences. Yeah, and that might have been a bit of unfortunate politicking at the time, actually. Ed says if GST increases come in, it will be unfair on self-funded retirees and pensioners as well as those on low incomes. What do you think, John?
Yes, that's right. I think if you look at self-funded retirees have a specific income coming out of their income stream and they can't increase that. I mean, their retirement funding is dependent on what the market is doing. So they won't be able to increase their income, and so as a consequence the increase in prices will be something that will be borne by them.
Now, interestingly, Treasurer Scott Morrison was on 7:30 just last night talking about cutting taxes. He says that we can grow our revenue. He says that the tax system is holding the economy back, that we're in a transition period where everything is a bit volatile. How does the GST increase play into that situation?
Well, the debate at the moment is about the increase in the GST giving you extra income, which is then churned back in compensation. It doesn't make any sense. Why are you going to do that? But then there are other parts of the debate which say, well, maybe we could cut taxes, and who would be the beneficiaries of these tax cuts? Well, you mentioned New Zealand as an example. If you look at the New Zealand income tax structure, the highest marginal tax rate is 33%, kicks in at 70,000 New Zealand dollars. Well, okay, if we want to go down the New Zealand route of 15% GST on everything, including food, health, education, water and sewerage, then is that the route we're going to take? And of course that means you've got less ability to address inequality through the system, and you have growing inequality, and that creates social problems in itself.
Yeah, look, I think you can't really have it both ways. And I mentioned earlier the much, much higher consumption tax rates in Scandinavian countries, for example. But there, the entire social agreement, the social compact, is that very high tax rates will result in an enormous amount of social care, that you are completely picked up by the system as a result.
And I think one of the things there, if you look at the Scandinavian countries, the level of government spending is about 45% of GDP, whereas in Australia it's 26%. So that social compact requires a large amount of spending on your health, education, on social welfare and so forth. Although I would also point out that Finland and Denmark, in terms of inequality, have been the fastest growing countries in terms of inequality in the last couple of years. And so they're becoming more unequal as well, even though they've got these social compacts. And one of the contributors to that, of course, is a GST.
Quite a few more texts coming in. You've hit a nerve here, John. Rob says, what happened to the LNP argument about not being able to tax your way to prosperity? Does that only apply to taxes that impact the top end of town? Funny how the LNP is so gung-ho on whacking the working classes only when it comes to tax gouging. Luke says, I get the feeling your guest doesn't pay much tax. Death duties mean selling the family farm when the parent whose name it's in dies. We've been through that, Luke. That's certainly true. Peter says, though, many people neither earn a wage and hence pay tax or receive welfare payments, so the compensation proposal leaves them right out. And Ruth's also texted to say when the GST came in, we were promised the abolition of a raft of state taxes such as stamp duty. It never happened. Also, the feds say that the GST goes directly to the states. True to a point, but the distribution's decided by the feds and the ACT does poorly. About 30 seconds to make a final comment, John.
The GST is regressive, if you haven't got that idea already. And all of the points that your commentators have just made are valid, and if we had another half hour, we could go through them. But I think the main point is that there is a political issue here that needs to be debated, and that we need to start thinking about a more progressive tax system, not just one that relies on a GST.
John Passant, lovely to have you here. Thank you. And that's quite a response from people. Clearly, it's sparking the neurons among the listeners. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Genevieve.
John Passant, graduate teaching fellow and PhD student at the School of Politics and International Relations at the ANU, who's always had a bit of a specialisation in tax, its history and its application. You are listening to 666 ABC Canberra.